What if the real measure of how civilized we are isn't about what we build, but what we learn to live without? That's the powerful idea from our source material we're going to dig into today. It's a whole new way to think about progress, about harm, and really about the future of society.
All right, so let's get into it. Usually when we talk about civilization, the story is all about, well, addition, right? We point to the incredible cities we've built, the technologies, all these complex systems. Progress, in that view, is basically just stacking up achievements and getting better at doing stuff.
But the perspective we're looking at today just flips that on its head. It asks a really tough question. What if focusing on everything we've added actually makes us miss the real story, the story of what we've learned to take away, to subtract?
And that, right there, is the core idea. Civilization isn't some finished product, a trophy on the shelf. It's more like a compass. It's a process, an orientation, a direction of travel that's always moving away from harm.
So let's really break down what this new way of thinking about civilization actually looks like.
Okay, so you can see the two ideas right here, side by side. The common view, it's all about accumulation, what we add to the pile. But this new view is about orientation, what we choose to leave behind. Specifically, it's about gradually refusing to accept certain kinds of violence. And this is the real game changer. The measure of progress shifts from, hey, look what we can do, to look at what we no longer need to do to survive and thrive.
Now, thinking this way leads to a pretty radical new way of understanding harm itself. The source calls it violence as unfinished design.
This is such a powerful concept because it completely shifts the conversation. Instead of just blaming bad people or human cruelty, it frames violence more like a legacy system. Think of it like old, clunky software code we inherited from a time when we just had fewer options. The argument isn't that people weren't cruel, but that the problem is often baked into an outdated design.
And these old, harmful designs, well, they're protected by what the source calls the illusions of inevitability. And you've heard these before, right? First, there's the appeal to nature. Hey, that's just how the world works. Life feeds on life. Then comes tradition. Come on, it's how it's always been done. And finally, you get the appeal to realism. Look, it's unfortunate, but it's just the price we pay for having a big, complex society. These are the arguments that keep us stuck, the ones that stop us from even trying to redesign.
Okay, so this all sounds interesting, but is there any proof it actually works? I mean, can societies really outgrow harms that seem totally inevitable? Well, let's take a look at what this framework says we've already refused.
When you look at history through this lens, a fascinating pattern emerges. Just think about it for a second. Slavery, public torture, child labor. These weren't just sideshows. They were foundational, absolutely central to the economies and justice systems of their day, and every single one was defended as completely necessary. But according to this view, they didn't disappear just because people had a change of heart. No, they were made obsolete. New systems, new technologies, and new ways of organizing society came along and simply provided a better alternative.
And that is the absolute key takeaway. In every single one of these cases, people were terrified that society would collapse without these things. But it didn't. It just redesigned itself. It found new ways to meet its needs without having to rely on that specific form of harm. It literally changed its direction of travel.
All right, so let's take this powerful idea and apply it to one of the oldest, most fundamental systems we have, how we get our food.
I mean, this quote just puts it so perfectly. Eating is our oldest deal with the world. It came before we even had words for things like justice or harm. It's so foundational to our very survival, which is probably why it's been so protected from these kinds of big questions for so long.
And you have to remember, for most of human history, there was no real choice. The need for food was this immediate, relentless pressure, a constraint. So the harm involved, well, it wasn't really seen as a moral choice. It was just a brutal fact of life.
And this comparison really gets to the heart of it. For an animal in the wild, hunting is just a biological condition. There are no other options on the menu. But for an intelligent system like us, a species that can literally invent new ways of doing things, well, it stops being a condition and it becomes an architectural design choice. The moment alternatives become possible, the whole thing becomes morally significant. And that, right there, changes everything. So this is the question we're now able to ask. As our technology and our design skills give us completely new ways to create food, that old excuse of necessity starts to look a little shaky, doesn't it? Is this violence really still necessary for our survival?
So how does a big change like this actually happen? Well, it's not about finding some perfect magical solution overnight. The key idea is that as soon as an alternative works well enough, the whole argument for the old, harmful way starts to fall apart. Suddenly, the burden of proof shifts. It's no longer on the innovators to prove their new way is perfect. It's on the defenders of the old way to explain why it's still necessary. And get this, ethics doesn't lead the charge here. It sort of catches up to what our own ingenuity has made possible.
Okay, let's zoom back out for the big finish here and really land on the main takeaway from this whole framework. This idea of civilization as a direction of travel. Look, the goal here isn't to build some perfect, harm-free utopia. That's just not realistic. Every society, every single system has its flaws and causes harm in some way. So the point isn't about achieving moral purity.
No, the real measure of progress is subtraction. It's about counting up the number of cruelties, the different forms of violence that a society has successfully designed out of its operating system. It's about all the things we've finally learned how to live without.
And that leaves us with one last powerful question to think about. If civilization is this long, slow process of refusing violence, then what harms, what violences are we still defending as necessary today? What are the things we're doing simply because we haven't yet imagined or put in the work to build the alternative?